Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the very first episode of the Really Useful Podcast. I'm your host, Bonnie, also known as Old Teapot 7. I'm here with my co-host.
So Cora the Diesel, welcome everybody to the very first Really Useful Podcast.
It's a podcast we're discussing all railway series related stuff, and today we're gonna be starting this new podcast. It's very exciting for the both of us because we're both huge fans of the railway series.
I do like the Railway series. Technically, yeah. Without the Railway series, there would be no Thomas. So we do have to respect that fact.
Yeah, definitely. And so this podcast all came about one day. I was it came to my mind after Christmas of 2021, and I was one day reading the books, and then I thought to myself, why not start a podcast on the Railway series? Because the Railway series book club was doing a podcast, so I decided, you know what, might as well do one for myself since I love the books. So I discussed it with Sakoa, and we both agreed that, yeah, we could do a podcast, and here we are today.
Yes, here we are. Technically, there's more going to be more like a podcast slash review. We're not actually going to be doing what the book series is doing, and just basically actually reading the books. We're more just going to be discussing them, reviewing them, and the whole shebang. Basically, what we've been doing for our TV series reviews of Thomas.
Yeah, this is gonna work similar to our TV series reviews, but it's gonna have some liberties compared to the TV series reviews.
Yeah, basically.
So
one big difference is that we're reviewing books, not a show.
Exactly, and when you review a book, you need to read it entirely first.
Either you need to read the book first, or you can just basically listen to the audio version and pretend like you read it.
Yeah, pretty much. So today we got the one that started it all, the three railway engines. And before we get started with the book, we want to dedicate the first few minutes of this episode to discussing as to how this series is going to work, because you guys may be wondering how exactly are we going to review all the 42 books of the railway series plus the spin-offs we've been talking about.
Yes. So go right ahead. You explain this because this is all your idea, not mine.
All right. So the way this podcast is going to work is that we're gonna go through all the 42 books of the railway series, and in each episode we're gonna be talking about the four stories on it. There's one that has 5 stories, but we'll get to that book when we get to it. After we finish talking about each story and our thoughts on them, we'll give each story a score from 10 to 1, 10 being the best and 1 being the worst. And once we get done with that, we'll add up our scores, and then we say the overall score, and then we put it on a ranking list. Now, at the end of each season, so let's say at the end of this one, which is the final episode for this season, is going to be Gordon the Big Engine. After we get done with the first season, we're gonna do a tier list for the first 9 books we're gonna be covering in season 1.
Yes, pretty much. So basically, as Bonnie has said, at the end of each season, we'll just basically take all the books that we've read up until that point and put them on a tier list. Then obviously the tier list will change as we read other books, along the way. But yeah, that's basically the whole gist of it. And even before we get to the review, we're also going to do a little history on how each of the books came to be about and such.
Yeah,
and we might even go a little bit on how did the books do when it first came out.
Yes, and we do have a lot of information thanks to our trusty Thomas the Tank Engine Man book that I've been reading a lot prior to starting this podcast. So I have a lot of information.
So sit back tightly, folks. Grab yourself a popcorn and such.
Yep. So I think that's pretty much it. Do we have forgotten anything?
Not really. If you want, do you want to go a little bit a history, what are our personal histories with the Railway series?
Yes, that's a good idea. So, all right, so I didn't read the Railway series until 2012 when I discovered this book called Thomas the Tank Engine Story Collection. Don't buy that book. That book sucks. because it only has the first 13 books, but it skips book 14 entirely, and then it just cuts to book 15, and then that's it. It doesn't have all the stories of the Railway series. So then I kept I was so fascinated by the stories that I just I was so interested to see what this Railway series was about. And it wasn't until I will probably say 2013 when I discovered that the series had 42 books, and that there were more than 14. There were actually 42, like I said. And ever since I read the books as a kid. I was 9 years old when I first read them. I wanted to do this sort of podcast because I wanted to give my thoughts on all 42 books. So, Sekoa, what's your story what's your history with the Railway series? If that makes any sense.
No, I get you. So, like many kids, well, let's just say mostly American kids, I was one of those kids that, like, never knew about the Railway series for a long while. Which is interesting because, like, it was actually interesting because, like, because, like, at the intro of basically the intro of Thomas and everything, they always say, like, based on a Railway series by the Wyvern W. Audrey. But when you're a kid, like, you don't really want to read credits and such. You just want to see the episodes and such. So I never really paid too much attention to the Railway series. I didn't even know they existed until I want to say maybe around 2008 or maybe even 2009. Like, it was I do know, like, I eventually found out from, like, Wikipedia itself, not the Thomas Wiki, but Wikipedia itself. And
Speaking
once I
of the
learned
Thomas Wiki, it was brand new at the time when you discovered it. It was brand spanking new because the wiki started in 2006. So that was and you discovered.
2006. Okay, okay. Well, even then, like, around 2008 or 2009, like, the wiki existed, but I didn't know about the Thomas Wiki yet. So I basically learned about the Railway series through Wikipedia because, like, I was looking through, like, uh, every uh, every time I was looking through, like, the episodes guys, mostly from season 1 to season 4, they always say, like, this episode is based on this story and such. And it wasn't until, like, around when it wasn't until I went onto YouTube and everything, and I started searching up these stories, and that's when I was like, oh, okay, so this is where basically Thomas came from and such. And I started, listening to some of the stories, like, I've been, watching a lot of as a kid, from the TV series and everything, and I learned more about it and everything. And it's kind of funny that, like, you mentioned you didn't read the Railway series, or at least knew to, or at least known about it until like 2012. You were basically starting the Railway series just when the final book, like, was already over. Like, just when the Railway series had just ended a year ago. And I
Yes,
basically
I actually, and funny that you mentioned that because I had no clue that the Railway series had officially concluded until, let's see, 20. I didn't know it had concluded until I would say probably 2014. That's when I discovered that,
I think I think, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sure someone in the comments will probably correct me, but I think that was the assumption for a long while when book 42 came out, because, like, it was the first and only book that said the end and such, but nobody actually really thought that, like, the Railway series, like, actually did came to an end when that book first came out. And I think, like, I actually wouldn't be surprised if Christopher or someone in the family, had to confirm that, like, yeah, the Railway series was going to retire up until, after that book came out.
back when that book was being written, and I'm sure we'll save a lot of the discussion for that book when we get to it in a few years from now. Yeah, because that book is gonna be the grand finale for this podcast.
Spoilers.
No, spoiler alert. Okay, so anyway, when that book was being written, there was a lot of speculation as to what the book was going to be about. And when Amazon premiered the prototype cover, the prototype name was Thomas and His Friends, and a lot of people did not like that title. They hoped that the title would be different, but unfortunately, it carried that title all the way to publication. And also that book was written entirely from scratch, quote unquote. And I say that, but I'm not gonna say quote. I'm not gonna say why I say quote unquote. But I'm gonna leave that for when we get to the grand finale. But let's just say that book, that book how can
I
I
do
put?
know that book, like, originally it was meant to, like, celebrate, like, Wilbur's 100th birthday and
Yeah,
such. I
the
do know
centenary of
that.
the Reverend W. Audrey,
Yeah.
and sad to say that that book, along with Thomas and Victoria, is hard to find nowadays, and I still can't find a freaking copy of it.
Watch. One day it's gonna be on eBay and it's gonna sell for $1 million.
Oh God, no. And it's funny you mentioned that because I have four of Christopher's books.
Oh, interesting. Oh
Yeah,
yeah, that's right. You did tell me about that.
yeah. So
Anyway, so anyway, to wrap up the story and everything, but yeah, but yeah, it was around like it was basically around like around the late 2000s and such. I finally knew about the books and everything, and basically ever since then, like I do have a deep respect for the books and everything. I do like the stories and such, and basically, like I said, yeah, without the Railway series, we would never have Thomas, and to be fair, like it is. To be fair, like there is a reason why the books were very popular. Like they were very well written by Wilbur. He put a lot of he put as much realism as he could into the stories and such. And the characters, like characters are likable. The illustrations were very good as well too. Like I said, like it's a no brainer why Brit or pretty much like anyone else wanted to make like TV series out of those books.
there's a reason why these books became so famous. You said it. The realism and the characters, and it just didn't feel like any other typical railway book at the time. If you get what I mean, like the Little Engine That Could, Casey Jr., all
Yeah.
those types of characters.
Yeah. I do get what you mean because, like, yeah, and as you mentioned, yeah. When you read, like, or even seen, like, stories like, the Little Engine That Could, or even like, Casey Junior's, all the trains, like, while they do train things, they're still more cartoony and like, they sometimes, they don't. I wouldn't say like they don't put realism, but it's just more that like they just kind of do like whatever they want to do because like it's entertainment for kids and such. But when you read the Railway series and even like, the classic series of Thomas and everything, like, the trains, like, they don't just like, hop off from one track to another and suddenly, suddenly they can spin themselves around like whenever they could and such. No, they are still
And they can
actual
and
trains,
they also can use their wheels as hands. All engines
pretty much.
go.
Yeah. But pretty much like yeah, like they are actual real trains. And they do actual like real train things as well too. And I think that's why like Thomas stood out for a very long time. Like when he first came out and everything. There's a reason why he's still popular to this day.
Yeah, and he holds a special place in my heart because Thomas and Friends, as you may know, is my favorite TV show. I think you already know that.
But I think everyone also knows how much how much appreciation how much appreciation I have for the show as well too. Because like it was definitely one of these shows I did watch a lot of as a kid and such.
And I'm still a fan to this very day.
I'm still also a Thomas fan too. Like I said, I do have a very soft spot for the show.
Yeah, and also I do have a soft spot for the Railway series because it was probably up. I would say probably up until 2020. It was the only book series that I actually liked.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So with that, I think that wraps it up. And now let's move on to our main topic of this podcast, which is the three railway engines.
The very first book published in 1945,
May
although the
12th.
stories were actually made 2 years prior in
Yep.
1943.
Yep. The book was published on May 12th, 1945. And let's start. You want to do the history portion a little bit, and then I'll add up to it, or
How are we gonna do the history portion? Like, do you want to do it? Like, do you want to briefly explain, like, Audrey himself when he was very young, before like before like he started a family or anything, or you just want to go about on like on basically how the book came about and to begin with.
well, I guess we need to start at the very beginning, which is where when Wilbur Audrey, he was born on June 15th, 1911, in Romsey, Hampshire.
Mm-hmm.
He loved steam trains since he was only a baby.
Pretty much. And there was also a famous story about one of the places that he lived. There was a railway next to it, and there was an incline. and this will later become an inspiration for the
Yes,
story Edward
let
and
me look
Gordon.
it up here because in the Thomas Bible or the Thomas the Tank Engine the complete collection. I call it the Bible, but it's not. But let's see here. All right, so I'm gonna quote his words.
Go ahead.
All right, so let's start with this. Okay. We our house was near the Great Western Main Line, which here climbs for 2 miles at 1 in 100. A tank engine was kept at Botts Station, part of whose duties was to help goods trains up the incline. Lying in bed, I will hear both engines snorting up the grade, and imagine in their puffings and pantings the conversation they were having with each other. I had no doubt at all that steam engines had personalities. Unquote.
So yeah, there you go. So yeah, you could tell as very early on, Wilbur really did had a fascination with trains ever since then.
Yeah, fast forward to 1943, World War II was going on around that time.
It was still going on. It was still actually it was getting close to the end too. About 2 more years, but still then England was still fighting Germany and everything. America was still fighting Japan.
And it
It's
was
actually a
very
little
scary, and it was very scary around that time to be in England because Germany was bombing. I think Germany bombed Paris, if I'm not mistaken.
I don't know for sure. I mean, this is more again. This is more a railway series podcast. This is not a U.S. history podcast.
I
So
know, but
don't
it's
quote, don't
important. It's
quote, don't
important to
quote us on
mention that
So
it's
don't.
important. It's
Yeah,
important.
don't come to us to it. Don't come to us to a history lesson because we know nothing.
It's important to know because around that time, World War II was going on, and Wilbert, his wife Margaret, and Christopher, who was about 2 years old, they lived in a house, and they had to be.
It basically had to try to survive and everything from like all the bombings and such.
Yeah, and unfortunately, one day Christopher got ill with measles.
Yes, and yeah. So when Wilbur came to check on him, he decided to tell him a bedtime story, and that bedtime story would later become what we know today as Edward's Day Out.
Yeah, but before that, there was he one of Christopher's favorite things to hear was a rhyme, which was the early in the morning down at the station, all the little engines uh tucked. I think all the little engines tucked in the shed. Off comes the driver and pulls the lever. Off, huff, peep, peep. Here we go. You know that famous rhyme, the Puffer Billies. You remember that children's song?
I don't think I've ever heard of it before.
It's a children's song, but it started out as a poem, I believe.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so and so after that, then came the inspiration to write Edward's Day Out, and believe it or not, Edward was the first name that came up to Wilbert's mind when he was writing that story.
Pretty much, I believe. Chris even asked him what was the name, and that was the name he came up with.
Edward. Then we
Yep.
got Gordon. Gordon was named after a rude boy that lived in the same neighborhood they were living at the time.
Pretty much.
And then we got Henry, which that was another name that popped out of Wilbert's mind.
Yes. Although, fun fact, originally Edward, Gordon, and Henry, the engines were supposed to live on different railways and such. They were not meant to be together, but we'll get a little more into that because we're kind of skipping forward a little bit too fast. So let's bring back
Yes.
a little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let's
So let's bring
backtrack a
back
little bit.
about-
Yeah, let's backtrack a little bit. I was gonna say, Edward and Gordon had no title originally. That was the only story that didn't have a title, and it was one of the publishing agencies that gave it a title.
I see.
Yeah. So yeah, there were originally three stories, which were Edward's Day Out, Edward and Gordon, and the Sad Story of Henry, and there was one more, but we'll get to it in a moment.
Hmm.
And I think that's it and then after that the book was published in May 12, 1945, and it sold 22,500 copies. Yep.
Hold on. We need to find out, how did the book even get published to begin with?
Oh yes.
It's kind of a little. That's kind of a little broad thing to say. I mean, it's kind of a little very short thing to say. It's just more. It's just us going It's just us going Here's the three stories they got published to a book. Let's get to the stories now.
All right. It's just that I don't have my notes here, so I forgot to write them down.
So I do know that correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe it was after I do know that I do know that around Edward's Day Out, and at least probably some around like Edward and Gordon, that the Reverend Andre had to write them down just so like he can tell the story to his son over and over again.
Yes,
And
because
once his
Christopher, because like this is something that's really brilliant from Wilbert's part, and it's true. Children are very smart. They
They
are.
are like a couple children like they are very smart, clever little things than we give them credit for.
Yeah, so Christopher, who was still young at that time, he began noticing some gaps on when Wilbur was telling the stories to him. So he decided to write them down just so he didn't forget, how the stories went.
Pretty much. And once his wife Margaret found out about these stories, she was actually the one to try to convince Wilbur to try to publish these stories. However, Wilbur had no luck in trying to finding a publisher at the moment.
He went to 5 different publishing agencies and they all turned him down. One was very close in accepting it, but he had to turn it down due to paper shortage.
Because again, World War II.
Yeah, at that time, paper was expensive, and food was very difficult to get at that time as
War
well.
sucks.
Yeah, pretty much. And so it wasn't. I think it wasn't until February of no, not yet. It wasn't until 43, I believe, where they finally found Edmund Ward, who
Yes.
was the one that accepted the stories for publication.
And
However,
he was also the one that wanted Wilbur to create a fourth story for the book, Edward, Gordon, and Henry.
yes, and originally the 4 stories were gonna be 4 separate books, but it was Edwin Ward's idea to have them published as one whole book.
And it was also his idea that that the engines should meet on the same railway too.
Exactly. And Wilbur apparently did not. This is still speculation, but this is according to the Thomas Tank Engine Man. Wilbur was annoyed with his requests, but he relented and wrote them anyway. He wrote the final story, and no publication date was announced until February 1945. That's when Edmund Ward finally announced that the book was being printed.
And yeah, as Bonnie has said, like it sold really well. It sold like lots of copies, and here we are now. That was just basically the Reverend's
It sold out.
first
It
footstep.
sold out very quickly to the point where they couldn't keep up with the demand, so they decided to reprint them with a second order of 16,000 and 17,000. It was
So yeah, there
so.
you go. That's basically Wilbur's footstep in becoming an author.
Yep. And but the railway series is not a series yet. It's
Not
only
yet.
one book right now because we still have a lot of more history to cover. But we'll get to that when we get to the second book in the next episode.
Pretty much, and yeah, get ready because that's gonna have a lot of history behind it.
Yep. So with that, let's move on to the book itself, and let's start with the very first story. And I'm gonna let's of course start with this one. The first story we got is Edward's Day Out, the story that started a whole legacy.
Alrighty then. Well, Edward's Day Out. Do you want me to give like a short summary about what each of the story is about, or just
Yes,
go
I
straight?
think we should do that. It's important we do that.
All right. So Edward's Day Out is basically a very short and simple story. It's just basically about a old engine named Edward, who's been very sad that who's basically been very sad because he has not been out for a very long time, hence the title. And basically, it's driving a fireman be like, "Hey, we're gonna get you outside here today, so let's go." And basically, that's basically about it. Is Edward enjoying his day out. The end. Anyway, so yeah, Edward's Day Out for the first story, like it's a pretty solid start to the book. Pretty short, very simple. But to be fair, like that's just basically like with any new stories. Like you do want to start off with at least something simple enough to grab the reader's attentions just a little bit. And again, keep in mind it was also a bedtime story for Christopher. So yeah, it is going to be very simple and everything. But as far as simple story goes, it's still memorable enough. One thing I did actually notice. One thing I did actually notice. Um, let me collect my train of thoughts. So basically, one thing I did notice is that basically like we're not really informed too much on just exactly how old Edward is just yet. We know
Exactly.
we basically know that like he is old and such, but we don't know how old because because so far, like, he's still able to pull, like, coaches and such. He's able to, run on the line just fine and everything. But pretty much once we, pretty much, especially when we get to like, especially when we get to like a little bit of the second story and even the last story, we are going to see just a little bit just how old Edward really is and such. And especially when we get to like, season two, that's when like, the Reverend Audrey is really going to capitalize on just how old Edward is getting year by year and such.
Pretty much, pretty
Yeah,
much.
but it's
And
still.
I think
Oh, go ahead. What are you gonna say?
yeah, I was gonna add to that. I think the epitome where we learn that Edward is really old is in. I would say that we'll probably have to wait until season 3 to find out.
Pretty much, yeah. But yeah, it's also pretty interesting because, like, even though he is old, like, especially when you get to like, the station scene, like, he was kind of a little bit impatient too, which was very interesting because, like, if this was like, later Edward, like, if this was like later Edward, he probably wouldn't mind too much. I mean, he would still be cross, but I don't think it would be like, impatient. But in the first story, he was just basically like, hurry up, guard, I want to leave right now and such. Which is actually pretty, which again is actually a very interesting note to notice.
Pretty much.
Yeah. Um. Do we also want to talk about the illustrations in the book, or do we want to save them for
Well,
later?
of course. Well, if you want to, like the illustrations are the heart of the railway series, in my opinion. So why
Pretty
not?
much. All right. So for at least, so yeah, even the illustrations. Now the ones I'm talking about are the ones that are mostly known by
See Reginald Dalby.
yeah, see original Dolby and everything. The illustrations for the first book are actually pretty good. They're nice and colorful, and it actually does invite you, into the story quite nicely. So I will definitely say for the introduction for the first story, it does a really good job on like introducing Edward just well enough that like you're actually happy that like you're basically actually happy that he's finally let out and everything, and you hope that you get to see more of him, somewhere in the near future. Uh, so definitely for the first story, I will definitely give it like a solid 7 out of 10 and such for a very good story.
And
Yes, it's short and yes, it's short and simple and everything, but like I said, for a short and simple, and even for like first story and everything, it does a good job on setting up the railway series and basically like how we're gonna expect the books in the later years.
exactly. And then and where was? Oh yeah. Now let's talk about a little bit of about the elephant in the room, which is William Middleton's illustrations. Before I give my opinions on the on Edward's Day Out.
Why
William,
are trains so little?
exactly. Why are the trains so little? All
It
right.
looks like
So
they got squished.
all right. So William Middleton is probably one of the most forgettable railway series illustrators.
Well, there's a difference between forgettable and infamous.
All right, well, infamous, yeah, and forgettable at the same time. But the reason why the illustration looks so bad is because he didn't think a book about dirty steam engines would be popular, so he decided to put as little effort as possible. And well, this is the result.
I mean, hey, it's still so well, so I guess maybe people really like seeing, dirty old steam trains.
Yeah, and in 1949, that's when C. Reginald Dalby decided to re-illustrate the book to fit his style, which was a pretty smart move, in my opinion.
Yeah, it was. Well, it was a pretty smart move, and it definitely made the book look a lot more cleaner.
Pretty much. So Edward's Day Out, I think it's a really good introductory story to the Railway series, and it's a really good introduction to Edward as a character. The
Hmm.
Edward we get in this story is much more different than the Edward we get later, as you mentioned, because
Yeah,
current Edward would pretty much be patient, but he would be cross, yes, like you said, but he wasn't as impatient as he was in this story. But this is the very first story, so we can pretty much forgive that.
yeah. And I also want to say too, like, not just impatient, but this is also probably like one of the few times, right? We're gonna see Edward being really emotional and such too, because like like I said, it's the first story, but like when you see him actually crying and everything, like again, like it's probably one of the few times we actually ever see Edward looking, upset and such, or actually, feeling a different kind of emotion, which again really does show you on how much like he's going to grow and mature later on as the books goes as the series continues and such.
Pretty much. Pretty much, and there's a reason why Edward is probably the second most favorite character out of the whole franchise.
Pretty much.
Yeah. So the story's pretty simple. I do like that, I do like that we get to see, something simple like, Edward just going to the station and then just waiting for the guard.
Hmm.
It's a bit simple when you think about it, but it's done so well that you pretty much, don't mind.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, that is one thing I will say that I think actually does work in a story. It doesn't actually drag on for too long either. Like, it's short, it's simple, it's just basically there, and it's basically short and simple enough that, like, it doesn't actually break. It actually doesn't break the pace of the story. It actually does flow, pretty nicely, especially at the end as well too. Like, when you get to the end, you're actually pretty. It actually leaves you with a really satisfying taste, which is actually a very good sign for a first book and for a first
Exactly.
story in general.
The first story should always grab the audience. That's the most important part of, the Railway series. The first story should always, grab the audience, and if it grabs them really well, then you're gonna be in for a really good time, like this book, for example. So Edward's Day Out, for starting a whole franchise as a whole, I would give it a 9 out of 10. This is a really good story to start off the Railway series. It's a simple story, but it's done really well to the point where it's really, you don't mind, because it's short, simple, and you don't think too much about it, and it doesn't drag on for way too long, like you mentioned.
Yeah, I will also say too. I think the TV series actually does a very good job on, like, I do understand why they want to cut out the beginning part. When we get to, like, Edward and Gordon and everything, because yeah, like, even though I do like it, it doesn't really add that much to the overall story, so I can see why they want to cut it. But at the same time, like, they actually do a good job on, like, showing the montage of, like, basically, like, Edward going around the railway and such.
Pretty much. So yeah, what was your score for Edward's Day Out?
What's the 7 out of 10?
All right, I give Edward's Day Out a 9 out of 10. So yep, really a really good start right there. A really good start.
Alrighty, and then on the next one, speaking of Edward and Gordon, that's the next story of the book, Edward and Gordon.
Edward and Gordon. So this story was originally untitled, like I mentioned back in the history portions. It was a literally agency that gave it a title. So
And what a title was. It was
Edward and Gordon. That's it.
Ed- Edward Edward and Gordon. If that was made today, people will probably question why it's called Edward and Gordon.
Well, to be fair, they're the only two characters featured in the story, so kind of
Yeah,
makes
I
sense.
mean, that's true, and I mean, yeah, I get used to it because this is basically like, this is kind of like a running gag. Well, not much gag, but it's kind of like, a running thing, like, throughout the books and such, where basically the title is just like a character and an object. That's your title.
Pretty much. So, Edward and Gordon, we get introduced to Gordon, which is a very popular character. And,
And well, actually, go ahead.
and in this book, he's actually brand spanking new to the railway. He was just built. Just came out of Doncaster Works, and he was brought to Sword the same year this book was, written, published. No, sorry. In the year that this book takes place, which is 1923, he was brand spanking new at the time. And
Yep.
and because he's so young, he's he's a grumpy, rude as fuck, and a total hotshot, like the Unlucky Tux said.
Yeah, pretty much. Although, like, although it's very interesting that he's young, but he's also, like, grumpy. You kind of would think that would be more suited for an old man.
Pretty much, and Gordon in this younger version of Gordon, unlike his later self, only likes to pull coaches. If he gets something like coal trucks, he gets angry, and he doesn't want to put the effort into pulling them.
Which, yeah, let's actually talk about that a little bit too, because the Reverend Audrey always, like, wanted his engines to, like, be like children in a sort of sense, whereas, like, there's still and this is going back to where he said that, like, he believes that, like, engines do have personalities as well too. And to be fair, like, he actually really captures that very well, especially with Gordon and such. Now, to be fair, I've never seen a steam train in real life and everything, but even then, like, again, like, he finds a really good perfect balance on, like, still having them be, living being machines, but still have them personalities as something like, a kid. And this is something like a kid probably would do. Like, if you made a kid do something they don't want to do, then yeah, they're not going to put any effort, or they're probably not just going to do anything at all, as we're seeing right here with Gordon.
Pretty much. So Edward and Gordon is about it's a story about Edward and Gordon. Basically, we just it's basically like a compilation of what the two engines like to do and what they don't like to do. Pretty much.
Well, it's just more on like what their personalities are like too. We actually do see that like the personalities are actually will completely different. With Edward being wise and kind, and Gordon being, as you said, kind of like a pompous ass and everything too, and just basically a character that just basically wants to do what he wants to do, and yeah, and like I said, those two characters are actually very different from one another too, and it's actually kind of a shame that like we don't really get to see them interacting all too much, like even in both the books and the TV series sometimes.
Yeah, I think in the later CGI series they interact a little bit more because in episodes, for example, like Old Reliable Edward, for example,
Yeah.
that's a really good episode where they interacted. So Edward and Gordon is, this is the first book where the infamous gag that plagues the TV series started. Gordon gets stuck on the hill,
I can't get up the hill because I'm lazy.
pretty much, and that became a huge gag in the so sort of in the TV series.
It did became a gag a little bit, but I would say like it became more of a gag more so in like the hit era, because like it wasn't that much of a gag in like the classic series too much.
Yeah, the hit era was infamous for Gordon getting stuck on the hill nearly every time.
Yeah, and actually to be fair, I think the CGI series only did it a few times too. Like it didn't really overplay it that much.
Yeah. So the story, it's Edward. We get to see Edward shunting, and then we get to see Gordon pulling the dirty coal trucks, and then we get the infamous line: "A goods trade, a goods trade, a goods trade. The shame of it, the shame of it, oh the shame of it." Which would later become a infamous catchphrase for Gordon.
Yes, it was that catchphrase and not "Oh, the indignity."
Dignity. Yeah, and the story ends with after Edward pushes Gordon up the hill, Gordon runs so fast that Edward's left behind, and the driver and fireman say they're very pleased with him, and the story ends with the driver telling Edward that they're gonna repaint him, and then they finish the story by saying, "Then you'll be the smartest engine in the shed." What
Yay.
what can you say? What can you say about that? Edward and Gordon is a really good story. Like following up what the previous story did, and continuing on developing Edward as a character, and we also get to see Gordon for the first time. And as a story, I will give it an I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10 because I'm feeling generous.
Alrighty.
Oh, what about you?
So yeah, like I said, going back to what I'm saying about the characters having different personalities. I'd say I would definitely say like again, this is a real Wilbur did a good solid job on like you said, continuing the characterization of Edward, as we do see that like yeah, he is a kind and slowly becoming a wise old engine and such, and then we see Gordon, like you also said, young, brand new. So like, yeah, he's gonna be arrogant, he's gonna be bossy and everything. And again, I actually do think like those two personalities, really mash together real well and such. Which again, it's a shame that like we don't get to see it too much, like in the Railway series. But when we do see it and everything, like they're basically character dynamic and everything. Like it really does show on like the polar opposite of those two and everything. And again, basically, when we get to like the later stories of the Railway series, we're going to see both of them growing in different ways too. Another thing I actually do also like too, in terms of like the story and everything. Again, like again, just more for like the personalities. I actually do feel like the second story, like there was a little bit more of an action involved too than like the previous story. The previous story was just like I said, more of an introduction. Here's the railway. This is what like the engines mostly do and everything, and this is pretty much what you're gonna expect and such. So now that we got the introduction out of the way, this is the second story is where the action's going to get started and everything. Where we see, Edward trying to, help Gordon up the hill. And again, you can really, feel that happening. And actually, let's take a break and talk about Johnny Morris for a little bit,
Oh
the
yes,
narrator
Johnny
and such.
Morris. All right,
Yeah.
so before we get started with Johnny Morris, let's talk about our experiences with Johnny Morris because I think it's important we do talk about this. So
Alrighty.
Johnny Morris, the first time I heard Johnny Morris was in 2012 when I discovered the Railway series for the first time, and for him, well, technically the first person to read the books to record an audiobook was the Reverend W. Aldrich himself. He did record the first two stories in an EP. That's very rare now.
Hmm.
So then after that, they brought in Johnny Morris, who, like Ringo Starr, was very reluctant to read the stories, and but he put as much effort as he could, and he did a good job. And in this book, he really did a good job, in my opinion.
Yeah, same. I was gonna say, especially in this story, like when you get to the scene of like Gordon's hill and everything, you really can feel like both Edward and Gordon struggling up that hill. Like he captured that action so well that you could actually picture that happening. And again, like I think he does a really good voices for like both Edward and Gordon. I think he captures Gordon's like bossy, self arrogant personality really well to a point. And again, he does a good job on showing Edward as a kind, wise old engine. So yeah, I definitely do agree that like Johnny Morris really captured that story like so well and everything that like it definitely does bump my score up a little bit because like I said, and again, the art is really good too. Like again, the art is real good. It captures the action scene really well, especially like when Gordon is racing down the hill and Edward's trying to catch up. Like
Oh
you do,
yes, oh yes.
yeah, yeah.
One of my favorite illustrations from Edward and Gordon is the illustration where Gordon is up the hill. That's
Yeah,
one of
pretty
my.
much. Uh,
That,
you do actually see him looking very proud, and especially in the next shot, you see Edward literally trying to catch up, but he just cannot catch up to the big fat engine. And hold on, phone.
oh boy. Yes, folks.
Never mind. Oh,
Yeah,
oh,
yes, folks.
oh.
Get used to this because it's gonna
Yeah,
happen in
that's
a couple of
yeah,
episodes.
it's gonna happen a lot. No one's really no one's really no one, the caller ID is not showing. So for all I know, it could be the Reverend Audrey coming back from the dead.
Maybe he's happy that we're reviewing the Railway series, which I don't
Or
mind
maybe,
because it's fun.
maybe he's probably maybe he's probably calling, maybe he's probably calling saying like, "What are you saying about my narration again? You saying I was a
Anyway,
bad narrator?"
back to the
Anyway,
illustration where you were
anyway.
back to
So
the
yeah,
illustration.
so yeah, like I said, I think the illustration again captures the action scene, so well. Then when you get to the ending and everything, again, the ending leaves you really satisfied and everything about basically about like basically how the conflict was, resolved as well too. Um, do we also want to talk about the trucks for a little bit, or should we save that for the next book? Because I feel
I
like the
think we
next
should
book.
save that for the next episode because
Yeah,
they
yeah,
really
yeah,
don't
because
have
this is basically where the trucks are gonna get more of a personality later.
much of a personality in this book, but they're just basically there as a plot device in order for the story to
There's
advance.
both a plot device in there to basically like sort of like a little sort of a little funny scene and such too.
Yeah, but
There,
and speaking of Johnny Morris, I love what he does with the trucks with the
oh oh oh
oh.
oh. I could just imagine I could just imagine all the trucks like don't like being bombed, and then there's that one truck that just secretly likes it. That's why he always goes oh oh yes bump me again please.
That's one of the things I love about Johnny Morris is that Johnny Morris takes something that is usually not funny and he makes it
It
funny.
just makes it even more funnier too. And again, like I think we'll probably say this when we get to like the fourth story and such. But again, he's a very good sound effector as well too. Like he make yeah, the
Whistles.
shuffling, the shuffling, the whistle, and like yeah, wheezing sounds and everything. He does a pretty good job on like trying to make it sound as realistic as he can.
Pretty much.
So
So
yeah, anyway, for my rating of the story and everything, again, like, it does a good job, picking up where the last story left off, some good action, again, nice resolution at the end, and again, like, it also does a really good proper introduction to Gordon. So I'm gonna give that story like, I'm gonna give the story, you know what, I'm gonna give it like, um, I'll give it an 8 out of 10. Why not? Yeah, I'll give it an 8 out of 10.
all right, so 8 out of 10 for the both of us.
Yes.
All right. So next we got, oh boy, oh boy, the sad story of Henry. Anyway,
Yeah, the controversial story that's actually made it in news before too, which is actually very surprising.
pretty much. So Sakoa, what's the sad story of Henry about?
So the sad story of Henry. Basically, Henry does not like the rain. He gets into a tunnel. People are stupid. People are stupid because they think they're superhumans. They could pull an engine out of a tunnel, and basically they just try it 3 times. And they're just like, you know what? And it's basically like, you know what? Screw you. You stay in the tunnel, and Henry stays in the tunnel. The end. And technically, it actually would have been the end if that fourth story had been made. Henry would probably would have been left to rot. So
Pretty
that would have been a much,
much.
much more darker ending if that was to happen.
Pretty much. So this story has a lot of problems.
Yeah. So
Go
okay,
ahead.
actually, yeah, this is something that like both me and Barney actually realized as well too. Is that like did Henry actually break down when he stopped in the tunnel, or like why did he actually I mean, we know the reason why he stopped in the tunnel because he's afraid of rain, but normally like but normally like but this is actually one of the few times where like the engines kind of are stopping on their own and such too, and like there's no really a real explanation on like why he's not starting again. Did he break down? Like, is the driver and fireman having problems? Starting him up again or something. Like, this is one of the few times where like realism. Well, okay, again, there's some realism, but like there's one of the few times where realism is kind of thrown out the window, and like it's just and you just kind of had to accept the story for what it is, which some could say it's a good or a bad thing.
And with us, it's a bad thing, and I'm gonna be 100% honest. So, but before I give my thoughts, let's start with Sakoa so he can give his thoughts on the story because we
Alrighty, so I will say, looking at the story again, like the story like is very hit and miss with a couple of Thomas fans. Like you'd be surprised, but there are actually some Thomas fans that hate this story. And reading again multiple times and taking a look at like both the criticisms and people that actually do like the story, I actually see where both of them are actually coming from. So, again, let's start with like the bad stuff first. Yeah, when you kind of think about it, the story doesn't really. I mean, stuff happens, sort of, but at the same time, like, it just kind of stands still to a halt. So, this is the first time where, like, we get a story where it's like, three strikes and you're out, which is something that's going to happen a lot in terms of, like, the TV series version and such. Um, and basically, yeah, like the plot is just as you just said. People try to get Henry out of the tunnel, and that's it. There's some kind of funny moments here. I will admit, like the funny moments where like the reason why the fat director doesn't want to like pull up push Henry is kind of a little, it's kind of a little funny. I will admit. But again, yeah, like they don't really give a real reason as to why Henry just can't move. Like, why can't yeah, this whole situation would have been avoided if like, either the driver or fireman were like able to like make Henry move, because like you can still make him move, right? He didn't break down, he just stopped. That's
Yeah, because I still this I'm gonna be honest. This part really frustrated me when I was reading the story. But why the red engine was pushing him? He should have moved, but for some reason he's not moving.
yeah, like yeah, like what's the reason? Like, did like the driver accidentally put on the brakes or something? Like, something got jammed and such. I mean with Thomas, like, okay, Thomas I can believe a little bit because Thomas is not really that strong to push Henry
Yeah,
out.
the TV series I don't mind because Thomas is small and that doesn't that's okay. But
Yeah,
in the but in
yeah,
the book,
and I just basically like how like so Topham Hatt is just like it's just like, oh, you want to stay in a tunnel? All right, well, I mean any sensible director will just kind of like try to pull you out and put you in a shed, but fuck it, you're gonna stay in the tunnel. I'm gonna take off the rails. I'm just basically gonna waste all this money and everything to brick you up. How do you like that?
All
And
right,
that's it.
so I should also mention this. And in the when Wilbur wrote the story for the first time, there was only one tunnel.
Pretty
But
much, yeah.
unfortunately, that when they were illustrating the stories, William Middleton illustrated the stories with two tunnels instead of one.
Yeah, which makes the other line, kind of pointless, where it's just basically like, they cut up a new tunnel, even though there was already a tunnel to begin with in the story. But forget that. They cut up a new tunnel.
Take our word for it.
Take our word for it, yes. So,
but anyway, I don't like the story, to be completely
so,
honest.
okay, let me finish a little bit on my rating real quick. I will admit, nothing really happens too much in the story. It pretty much just stalls at what it is. It is what it is. I mean, it's short and simple, so it's not like it goes on forever. But sometimes you kind of feel like it does to a certain degree and such that I'm actually kind of glad that Ward actually made Wilbur write a new story for this. Because to be honest, if this was like all the story there was, if this is basically like all there was to it and everything, then I don't know. I don't know. Would you think the story would be? Do you think the story would be forgettable, or would it be as memorable if it was just left on its own without like an ending or anything? Or
I think if the okay, my opinion, if this was a if this was a book on its own, it would have been awful, very
think so?
awful. Yeah,
Uh,
if this was to be the final story of the three railway engines, if it had Edward Gordon Henry not been written, it still would have been bad regardless, in my
yeah,
opinion.
because when you kind of think about it, yeah, like Edward and Gordon are not really in the story either. It's just more like Henry, and it's kind of more like a bittersweet ending. It kind of would have been, it probably would have left some kids, like even parents, a little confused about well, why the story was even made to begin with. That was all to it and such.
Yeah, and all this trouble could have been solved if the driver could have opened the freaking regulator.
He was probably high on something, and he probably just forgot,
Yeah,
right? Or maybe the fact director hired him straight out of high school.
that's a, it's a possibility, but you know.
But yeah. Actually, do we want to talk a little bit about the punishment? Because this is one of the punishment where, again, it's very split among the Thomas fans and
And
such.
it's also you know and it's also you know it also started some rumors that isn't true that
Yeah,
is
yeah, pretty much started rumors that Henry is just break that forever and he dies, which no, because spoilers, he actually does
never
get out.
dies. He just I think in my opinion he stays there. I think for like a week. In my opinion, I think for like a week if you think about it.
I I think it's set. I think it's applied to it might have been a week, maybe even like a month or something that he stayed in there. Is that really explain how long he stayed in there, but yeah, I think yeah, I think it's safe to say he probably stayed there for a few months because he said that a certain third was covering up his paintwork anyway. So I think it's safe to say he probably stood there for a few months or something.
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much.
Yeah,
So yeah, let's talk about the punishment. Yeah. So the punishment, in my opinion, the punishment is well deserved.
it is again, yeah. I will agree that the punishment is deserved because Henry was actually doing this.
He wasted people's time by staying in the tunnel.
Pretty much. So, because, if you thought Gordon was actually, a brat and such, Henry was really being a spoiled brat in the story and everything.
Pretty much.
Yeah, he was just basically, throwing temper tantrums and such and everything. Yeah, he does actually, he actually did deserve the punishment, in my humble opinion and everything.
Me
But I
too.
will understand why some people think it's going a little bit too far and such. And I don't think that Wilbert is saying break up your kids in your room or something if they misbehave. I think it's just more supposed to be an engine equivalent to grounding a kid if they're throwing temper tantrums and such. But I can understand why some people think it's going too far because yeah, there are actually some parents out there that do punish their kids way more worse than others. So I do understand if where people are coming from, but they're saying the punishment was a little bit too far.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I can understand where they're coming from with that. So yeah, you do have a good point there.
Yeah. So me personally, thinking on the story long and hard and everything, I wouldn't say it's the worst, far from it and such. But I do understand why it's very split. And looking at the story over ahead, it's so short. And like again, like stuff kind of happens, but at the same time, kind of not. It's like like kind of feels like there is action going on, but nothing's really getting resolved. Especially at the end, nothing was really resolved at the end, and it just kind of felt like not only was Henry wasting the passenger's time, but like Wilbur was kind of wasting the reader's time with the story as well too. It pretty much like again like if the final story wasn't written and pretty much this was the end of the story, it probably would have been so bittersweet. Then yeah, I think it probably would have been forgotten. For me, I think I'm gonna give the story a 5 out of 10. To be honest,
Meh story,
pretty much.
like you usually say in the reviews.
Yeah,
So as for me, I don't like the story, and I'm being completely honest. I really don't like the story. It's it's just that it's just like yeah, it's like Henry stays in the tunnel and that's it. He wastes the passengers' time. He doesn't want to move, and he deserves the punishment. And that's it. It's just too predictable. You know what's gonna happen before the story's even over.
pretty much.
So I'm not gonna be too harsh on the story. I'm gonna be honest and say that the funny moments do save the story a little bit, but it's still a bad story for me. So I'm gonna give it a 5 out of 10 as well.
Yeah. I will also say too, I do like how the I do like how the TV version actually, incorporates a little bit of like Edward Gordon and Henry into like that episode, so it doesn't feel like the story is bittersweet. It actually does feel more like you actually do want to see is Henry actually going to get out of the tunnel or is he going to stay there? Which I actually think like makes for a better cliffhanger than like the original story.
Yeah, one positive thing I will say about the Railway series version is that it's also a cliffhanger because there's one story left, and it makes you wonder: is he gonna get out of the tunnel or is he gonna stay there?
I mean, technically, it is a cliffhanger. Yeah, when you think about it, since yeah, again, I think Ward actually made the correct choice of having all the stories be in one book, if it was his own separate book, then people wouldn't think it was a cliffhanger. They would think it was actually the ending, and it probably would just be like, oh, okay,
Pretty much. So 5 out of 10.
yeah, 5 out of 10 for me and 5 out of 10 for you.
All right. So now we get to the final story, which is Edward, Gordon, and Henry.
Again, creative title.
Creative title. So Edward Gordon and Henry, we basically follow up as to what has been going on after Henry has been bricked up. And one day Gordon is pulling the express, but for some unknown reason, his safety valve explodes. Well, before he gets to the tunnel, and
Convenience.
convenience, pretty much. And so they bring Edward, but Edward can't pull the train, and so they finally decide to let Henry out of the tunnel, and Henry and Edward pull the train together. They get the passengers to their destination successfully, and then Henry's painted blue, which is very
For three more books, and then he's back to green in book 5, which we'll explain once we get to that.
pretty much. And yeah, that's Edward Gordon and Henry. It's a pretty good finale for the first book. So it's a very good story, and it finally it makes you realize that Henry has learned his lesson after you see him sad at the very beginning of the story.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
And
I don't have too much to say on this story because
it's another story that's like again, it's simple and such. Like it says what it says. Like all three characters finally meet and such. Henry actually learns his lesson. He pulls the train, and that's it. But there is actually some noteworthy I do want to mention and such too. Like after this story and everything, Henry's pretty much pushed as like a very very secondary character and such. Like it's going to be a while until like we get another story focus. Say we get another focus story centered around Henry, and it's going to be even more of a while till we get like a whole book dedicated to Henry as well too. And then pretty much after that, like I feel like this story is kind of one of those where it's just like uh, uh again, I don't know what was going through Wilbert's mind at the time, but I kind of think that like after he made like Henry the Green Engine, he was kind of stuck on like what he wanted to do for Henry because pretty much like Henry always learned his lesson. He's not afraid of the rain, and pretty much
Basically,
after that.
before Henry the Green Engine was, written, he hated Henry. I think you know that he
Yeah,
hated Henry.
I do know the story that like yeah he actually did hated Henry. I think that was another reason why too. Like he decided not. He pretty much didn't write too many stories revolving Henry because like well I understand Henry was kind of a difficult character for him to work with, and I can kind of see where he was coming from with that because when you really think about it, like in the Railway series, and even though Lucky Tugs mentioned this, Henry was just basically a green version of Gordon, if not even more meaner than Gordon in some parts.
Oh yes, wait till we get to the later books because that is gonna be very evident.
Pretty much. And yeah, it actually kind of does show that, like, yeah, like, Henry's probably one of the few characters where it's just like he already has a character set that, like, there's really not that much you can do with him. And again, some could say it's a good thing. Some could say, like, that might make him forgettable a little bit in some parts. But again, we could probably talk more about it when we get to like, books featuring Henry and such.
Yeah, pretty much. And there's one. There's one that we're gonna be covering that in a few episodes. That you know.
Yeah, pretty soon. It's actually pretty. I'm actually pretty interested to get to that book.
Oh yeah, same here. So anyway, Edward Gordon and Henry, really nice. Oh, before I give my rating, I almost forgot to say this. Like Henry's painted blue at the very end of this book.
And yeah, like I said, that's gonna cause problems. Again, we'll talk more about that later down the road. But yeah, keep an eye out for that.
At the time I read the story for the first time as a kid, I thought, "Oh, he's being painted blue. That's cool." Little did I know that that would cause huge confusion with my 9-year-old brain.
Yeah, actually, yeah, I kind of see where you're coming from because yeah, again, we'll get to it when we get to it. But yeah, if pretty much if like the Reverend never specifically stated that was Henry by the time like he was blue. Yeah, yeah, I can actually see how some people would mistake him for Gordon or something like that.
Yeah, pretty much.
Uh,
So,
go
yeah, go.
ahead. You go ahead. Finish.
All right, all right. So I feel happy that Henry has finally been out of the tunnel, and that scene, well, that portion of the story where Edward and Henry are pulling the express, that there's a feeling of satisfaction there if you think about it.
You do, and you know what? I think the TV series really capitalized that scene really, really well, especially with Henry's theme.
Yeah, there's a feeling of satisfaction that you feel happy that Henry has learned this lesson, and you're cheering Edward and him on for pulling the express.
Pretty much.
Yeah, so Edward Gordon and Henry as a finale to the very first book of the Railway series, I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10.
Alright. So yeah. As for me, again, also talking about like Johnny Morris's real quick. I actually like how he does like the coaches out with the blah.
It's gonna get even more funny
It
as we
it
go.
is. It's gonna get more. It is definitely gonna get more funny. But yeah, I do actually agree. I like yeah. Again, I do like how in the TV series, like they actually do set up like the part two coming up soon. And once you get to like the part two again, like it does a good job on like capturing that satisfaction and like yeah that like Henry has finally learned his lesson. You feel happy for him. And again, like even with Johnny Morris, like Johnny Morris actually does capture that that triumphant scene really well. Uh, 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 really well. That again, yeah, you are actually cheering for Henry and Edward when they're finally pulling the express. I also like how in the railway series too, Gordon is actually very happy for them, as opposed to the TV series where he's just basically like, "Oh man, they're doing it better than me."
Yeah, that's something that I never got. Like, why is he happy in the book version, but in the TV series he's pretty grumpy.
You know what? I can just imagine Gordon just being like, "Huh, let's." Actually, it actually does make sense because even in like James and the Express spoilers, he basically brags about like he basically brags on how like basically how like when he's not pulling the Express, they need two engines to pull it. So maybe that's probably what he was thinking in the TV series, where it's just like, "No, that's not impressive. You needed two engines to pull the Express. I'm still better than you."
Oh
Perfect.
man.
And again, like the Reverend Hunter actually did write a good funny scene with like the fat director and the goat. Like that again, the TV series actually does capitalize on that very well. And again, makes it pretty funny. So
It will later come back in season 5 and bah where the ram ate the hat.
pretty much. So that's actually twice that Stalin had his hat eaten by goats.
Well, it's a ram in season 5,
It's
but
kind of the same thing.
yeah, pretty much. Pretty much.
Anyway,
Yeah,
so
so
quick.
what do you think before I forgot to mention this. What do you think of the whoosh where the
From
safety
Johnny
valve
Morris and everything.
explodes?
Okay, so like yeah, the valve exploding. From what I understand, like it was kind of common for like steam engines to have like safety valves, bursting or something. I think it's only like if they're pulling too fast or too hard, and yeah, basically their safety valves will explode. So like, so like it was something that like can't really have. Where it's not too out of the ordinary. It's just more that like yeah, again, it's just more play for convenience, just so like Wilbur can have a reason as to why Henry could pull the express. I actually do kind of like I actually do kind of like the reason why he put Edward in the story too. I could just imagine Wilbur. I could just imagine when Wilbur was writing the story, he was just like, "Wait, yeah, I need Edward too. Edward, you pull the train. Oh wait, Edward can't pull the train. Okay, Henry, now you pull the train." And again, I also like how in like the book series, like I could just imagine like either the bricklayers, were smashing down the bricks, or Henry was being like the Kool Aid Man, and he just basically like ran the bricks and everything with him. So he was just like, "Oh yeah,
Oh yeah. But oh, I'm so stiff. I'm
I'm
so
so stiff." Giggity.
I do love Johnny Morris's Henry voice.
Oh yeah, that was something that was something we didn't mention in the last story too. But I actually love like how they put the echo sound effect when like Henry was in the tunnel as well too.
Yeah, that's something that when other narrators took over, they didn't bother doing that. I think Johnny that was exclusive to only Johnny Morris, I believe. I
Yeah,
believe. I may be mistaken.
but yeah, I do agree that like yeah, his Henry voice is really does suit him, especially when we get to book 6 and everything. Like it really does suit him to be like the engine that's like or again, he's stubborn, but I think it's also to show that like yeah, he's kind of like a very sick engine too when you think about it. And again, it definitely does show like when we get to like the later books too. So so yeah, I do agree that like yeah, Johnny Morris is
Even in the Nets book, that's where the first time we're gonna see that.
yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah. Actually, yeah, you're right. In the very next books.
Yeah,
uh, but yeah, like but yeah, I do agree. Johnny Morris's Henry voice real solid too. Again, like um again, he captures it very well. So yeah, so for me, the final story of the Railway series, or at least in terms of the three railway engines, the final story is actually a very good one to end up the book. Like it shows the three characters off real good. Again, there's a conflict and everything. And then there's like a nice little scene where like the conflict is resolved and everything. It's brings you good satisfaction. So, for the final story, I'll give it a 7 out of 10. Good story.
all right, and that's the end of the three railway engines.
So let's go ahead and should we add up our score right now, or should we at least talk about what we thought about the book overall first?
Yes, let's do that because it's important for us. All right,
Okay.
so you go first. So
All
while I
right.
develop my thoughts.
Okay. So for the three railway engines, for the first book, it actually does a real good job on setting up, the world of. Well, actually, I don't think we know the world of Sodor just yet. So for all we know, there's just like a railway that has no name yet. But for pretty much like it does actually does it actually does set up the railway quite nicely. It sets up all three characters pretty fine to get their introduction out of the way and everything, what they're capable of, what we know about them so far, and how much they're going to be carried over in future stories and such. Again, like each of the stories again are simple, but as far as simple story goes and everything, it does a good job on like capturing you just enough that you actually want to keep on reading and everything. You want to see like how each of the stories play out and everything. Some of them are memorable for the right reasons as well too. So again, there's no reason why this book is sold, very well when it first came out, because yeah, the characters are likable. The characters are likable. The illustrations are very nice. Well, most so for Dalby and such. The original illustration, yeah, they suck.
Pretty
um,
much.
Pretty much. But for at least like the re-illustrations, I should say, they look very nice. They do actually capture the stories really well. Um, so yeah, for me, like the Three Railway Entrance is a good book, a very very good book to start off.
Pretty much. So before we give our scores, my turn.
Go ahead.
So for this book, there's a reason why this book became very popular. The stories, while some might be short and simple, they're damn
Hmm.
good for a reason.
Pretty much.
They're damn good for a reason, and I love the characters. I love the action that went on in the stories. And while one of the stories, did have a lot of problems, it wasn't the worst.
No, it wasn't. I agree with you on that.
It wasn't the worst, and and yes, I agree. The illustrations are fantastic. Even though Wilbur Aldrich wasn't a big fan of C. Reginald Dobby, I
Which we'll get more into that later.
yeah, we'll get more into that when we get to James the Red Engine, which is his proper introduction. If you.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, yeah. It is. It is his proper introduction because that was the first book he actually did. Help illustrate it anyway.
Yeah, but the re-illustrations, I should say, yeah, like you said, yeah, they look absolutely fantastic, and these are the illustrations I'm most familiar with when I think about the Railway series.
Pretty much. And again, there's no reason why, like Britt and David took inspiration for those illustrations too when they were making the models.
Yeah, pretty much. And so, the Three Railway Engines is a great book to start off a whole franchise, and and I'm really excited to keep reading. I'm really excited to keep reading the stories until we get to the finale.
Pretty
So
much.
the Three Railway Engines, solid book, 2 thumbs up for me.
Okay.
All
So
right.
so apparently we're gonna be the Siskel and Ebert of the Railway series now.
Nah, nah. I was only joking.
I
So
know.
so now before we end off, let's add up our scores.
Alrighty. So for me, okay, I gave it a 7 plus an 8. That's 15 right there. 5, that's a 20. And then I gave the final story, I believe, a 7 as well. So my final score would basically be a 27 out of 40, which, you know what? Let me get my calculator. So 27 divided
What
by
what what was the score?
40.
What was the score I gave to Edward, Gordon, and Henry? I think it was 8.
And we're going to, yeah, I think you gave it an 8 or something.
All right.
All right, so for me, adding up my scores and dividing them, so 27 out of 40. That technically means this one actually gets a okay. We're going by like grading system or a tier list. It basically almost gets like a 7. It almost basically gets like a D plus for me.
All right, so we're going. All right, so I got point 0.7. I'm multiplying it by 10, so it gets a 7 out of 10.
Oh, okay. So all right. So your final book is all right. So all right. So if we're going by numbers, then yeah, the final book and yeah, the final score for me in terms of the book will get like a 7 out of 10 for me as well.
Yeah, which is not bad. Not bad.
Yeah. Actually, let's see what your grades would be. So for the first story, you gave like what, a 7?
I gave yes. Let's see. Let me
You,
open up my calculator real quick.
I
Uh,
got I got the calculator ready.
all right. So the first story I gave it. Oh, my bad. I made a mistake. So the first story I gave it a 9.
Okay, so you gave it all right. You gave it a 9. So 9, and I believe the second one you gave like what, an 8?
I gave it an 8. Yeah.
All right, so
Sad
that's
story of Henry
17.
was a 5.
Okay, yeah. So 17, 22, and then the final one you said you gave it a 7 as well, 7 or 8.
I gave it an 8.
And 8. All right. So 20. All right. Let me see. So 9 plus 8, that's 17, plus 5, 22. 22 plus 8, that's 30. So 30 divided by 40. And you would give, and grading wise, you would give this book a C, a
Okay.
solid C.
Well, that's not bad.
No,
That's not bad. It did really so for you it got a D, but for me it got a C.
but it more got like a D plus, which is still not kind of bad. I mean, it's still a passing book, so we can say the book passed for us.
Yeah, pretty
And,
much.
to be fair, like to be fair, it actually does sum up on how we actually feel about the book. It's
Yeah,
short and
in
simple.
terms of score, mine gets a 7.5 out of 10. What was the score it gave you? What was the grading score it gave
It
you?
gave me like a 6.7 and such.
6.7. 6.7. So that's okay. All right. So 7.5 for.
So it actually does fit on like how we feel about the book and everything. Yeah, it's good. Yeah, it's still good. It's good for a first book. But there are definitely definitely when we get to the later books and everything, like they are definitely a lot more better in this book if we're being honest. At least if
Yeah.
I'm being honest.
Yeah, if you were to ask me about, let's say, if you were to ask me, I would say back in 2017, what were my thoughts on this book? I would probably say that aside from the sad story of Henry and Edward's Day Out, it was pretty meh for me.
Yeah, and to be fair, like I can see why this book is this book like sometimes does get mad for some because like I said they're short, they're simple, and yeah, that's pretty much all there is. That like compared to like the later books where there are a lot more actions involved, like especially in the second book right off the bat and everything, it definitely does make this first book not really much forgettable or anything, but it does kind of make it a little bit weak in comparison.
Yeah, pretty much, pretty much. And so with that, that's the end of the three railway engines. Man, this was fun. I have to.
This was actually pretty fun. Actually, I did actually enjoy it. So, I am definitely actually looking forward to seeing. Actually, I am looking more forward to seeing like how our scores for like the other books are definitely going to affect the final score overall.
All right, so we can't see this on the screen, but you guys are going to be seeing this on the screen right now. What you're seeing right now is our rankings for the three railway engines.
Pretty
So
much.
so I got a 7.5 and you got a 6.7, right?
Yes, a 6.7. And in terms of grading wise, my grade for the first book would be like a D plus, and yours would be a solid C.
Okay. All right. So not a bad start. Our this is still the first book, so you know,
Yeah.
nothing bad, nothing bad. So this book is great.
Please don't throw us a lot of bricks on our windows and such. It's just our opinions.
It's just our opinions, and if you
Yeah.
like this book, don't feel bad that you know we're ripping some of the stories to shreds. You know, like what the
Yeah. Because like I said, we may have our problems with the book, but we're not saying it's a bad book overall. We still both enjoy it for what it is, and again, especially for like the one that started it all, like it's very easy to see why this took off so well.
pretty much, pretty much. So yeah, that's the end of the first episode. Next week when we come back, we'll be doing the second book and possibly the most overplayed book in the entire.
Overplayed book, but again, when you read a story, it's actually for a very good reason. Yes, folks, we're gonna talk about the Star Billing Bastard.
Thomas the Tank Engine, and my favorite
Yes.
character.
Yep.
So anyway, guys, we hope you enjoyed this the first episode of the Really Useful Podcast. If you like this episode, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you guys want to see more episodes, hit that subscribe button as well. Also, don't forget to check out our channels in the description. Old Teapot 7 for me and Sequoia Diesel for Sequoia, and he also has a gaming channel, which I'll also leave the link in the description below.
Yes.
See you in a couple days for Thomas the Tank Engine. So this has been Bonnie with my co-host,
So Gora the Diesel.
and we'll be seeing you guys in the next episode of the Really
Bye
Useful Podcast.
bye.